Well, let me first of all say, Mike, that of course hazardness of place is not a concept that I coined in any way. It goes back to Ian Burton and Ken Hewitt back in the early 1970s when they used it to signify thinking about not just a disaster, which is the way we tend to think about disasters. We talk about, a typhoon or an earthquake, but to look at a place and look at the multiplicity of hazards that people who live there experience. And I think if I remember correctly, they were looking at somewhere in Ontario, I can't remember the town precisely in that early 1970 piece. But what I wanted to say by that, and something that I guess that a lot of my work has revolved around over what is now nearly 30, well, it is 30 years, is that it's to try and think of a more transnational history of the Philippines, where we think about the Philippines in relation to perhaps cultures and societies that we don't usually compare them to. So very soon after getting my PhD and starting to become an active academic, I began to sort of feel myself confined by the fact that I was always talking to other Southeast Asians. So we were, the Philippines is in Southeast Asia. And of course, we'd have all these arguments about whether it was, Paul's argument about exactly whether it should be or shouldn't be, or part of the, whatever. And, you find that most people who do work on the Philippines publish in journals that simply talk about Southeast Asia, and it's comparative. I don't want to do that I don't just want to do that. I think, there's a lot of things that about working in Southeast Asia and working in Southeast Asian societies, working in Filipino societies in particular, in my case, where you can share the types of methodologies, the types of thinking, the epistemology basically behind with a wider context. So I've always tried to put, even if I'm writing about the Philippines, I've tried to put my work in journals where it'll be read not just by Southeast Asianists, but by other people working in the similar area. So we can say, hey, look, in many cases, Southeast Asia, in many cases, Philippines is a leader in this. Or this is a really interesting example that has ramifications for a much wider audience. So I've always tried to do that. So what I was trying to say here is, okay, let's just think of not just the Philippines in its national context or even in its sort of a Southeast Asian regional context, but let's look at it in terms of other societies and other cultures that share similar problems. So, the Philippines has earthquakes. The Philippines has everything, just about. And, it's on the Arc of Fire, that stretches across the Pacific in a sort of ring where about 75% of all earthquakes and volcanoes take place. But it's also sort of in that way connected to the sort of alpine Himalayan orogenic belt that stretches all the way from the Atlantic coast in Europe all the way to certainly to Java and into, so why not start thinking about the comparison with other societies? So instead of looking, in terms of earthquakes with, say, or typhoons in case of the Philippines and Vietnam or something like that, why don't we think more widely? So I was suggesting there, Iranians and Italians suffer earthquakes in the same way that the Philippines does. Why don't we think about comparisons across, are there similarities? Looking at the track of typhoons, I mean, typhoons that come through the Philippines, if you read the Philippine newspapers, as soon as they get into the South China Sea, they're gone. But of course, they're not. They usually pick up strength again, and then they hurtle into Vietnam, or they hurtle into China, and then they curve round into Korea and Japan. So, there's a sort of, who was it? I think it was the French geographer Gouraud who talked about climatic unity in the sort of area of the South China Sea and, that typhoon belt around there. So again, trying to get people to think more transnationally and to get out of that sort of Southeast Asian regionalism, because I think that there's a lot to say. And I've now worked in Central Asia, and I'm working around the North Sea as well as in Southeast Asia. And a lot of the concepts, for instance, that are very common in terms of maritime practice, prestige goods and such like around Southeast Asia actually apply very nicely around the North Sea basin as well. From the east coast of England to the northwest coasts of Germany and Belgium, France, the west coast of Denmark. And the patterns are very similar. There's, I think, much more interesting sort of exchanges and comparisons that can be done. So what I was trying to say in that piece, in short, was let's start thinking a little bit more widely and putting Philippine history, Philippine studies in a much wider context.